40 years ago, when I was closer to BC than I am now, if anybody had told me that the city of Vancouver would confer the freedom of the city on an anarchist, I would have said it's not very likely. If anybody had told me that they would confer the freedom of the city on a writer, I would have said impossible.
What does it mean when you refer to yourself as an anarchist in the 1990s?
It means to me, I suppose, a person to whom freedom is the most important thing. Intellectual freedom and, as far as possible, physical freedom.
George Woodcock, who lives in Vancouver, has been called Canada's foremost man of letters and the most civilized man in Canada. The historian Ramsay Cook once observed that George Woodcock writes faster than most of us can read. George Woodcock is a master of many areas of prose, biography, history, travel writing, criticism, autobiography, political theory. He's also an accomplished poet and a playwright. He's recently been turning his hand to fiction. He's a dedicated anarchist and a social activist whose charity has helped communities from BC to India and Tibet.
Well, I suppose it was all part of the atmosphere of the 30s. I started to write in the 1930s, and you'll find that a very large number of writers of that period, even writers not attached to political parties or not involved in specific political philosophies, like Graham Greene, for instance, became very much concerned with the condition of society at the time. And I think that the most of the people of my time are in the same position. People like Spender Orden, they have lost their political interest, largely because of the disillusionment of the years after the 1930s. But at that time, one was full of generous kinds of enthusiasm, and one really tended to seek for some kind of idealistic philosophy.
40 years ago, when George Woodcock came here from London, this was called Cherry Street, and you could still see vestiges of a cherry orchard and tracts of farmland. It's from this very quiet suburb called Kerrisdale that Canada's most famous anarchist has written most of his 120 books.
I think one of the basic things in my life is the death of my father, who died young, who was a man with enormous talents, particularly musical talents, who never had the chance to develop. And I think that after he died, I was, in a way, impelled by the idea of completing that life.
You've written that creativity often comes out of early wounds. What were your early wounds?
My early wounds were the English school system, among other things. Though I went to a very good school, it's still the kind of discipline. And it wasn't merely the discipline, it was the way in which the boys got what was called the school spirit, which in most English schools is a brutal kind of, a pro-sporty spirit that militates against the intellectual who is looked on as a weakling.
One of the most influential people in your life as an artist was the anarchist Marie-Louise Bernari.
She was the daughter of a very famous Italian anarchist, a professor who had to flee from Italy for his beliefs and who was slaughtered by the communists in Spain. And she was an admirable person, very beautiful and intellectually extraordinarily bright. And in a sense, she was the chief personal influence on me in bringing me towards anarchism. Orwell was the sort of man who was full of grievances. He was very loyal. Once he got to know you, he was extremely loyal. He hated passionately and irrationally. I remember people who were really quite decent people who had still tagged along a bit with the Stalinist bandwagon, and Orwell was full of contempt and fury against them. I fell into a disagreement with him in the Partisan Review over something he said, and I pointed out that after all, he was a former police officer in Burma. He had his phase, he was attacking pacifists. He himself had been a pacifist 1 year before, and this kind of thing. And so I wrote this down, and Orwell wrote a furious reply, and then somehow or other, through an Indian writer called Mulkraj Anand. He invited me to take part on his Indian program at the BBC. So I did, and we were very formal. And then I was getting onto a bus up at Hampstead one day, and I saw in front of me a familiar crest of hair. It was Orwell. He'd seen me come across the street. He turned and patted the seat beside him, so I went up, and he said to me, Woodcock, we may have differences on paper, but that doesn't mean anything derogatory to our relationships as human beings. And with that, our friendship started.
In the center of empire, with hearts beating high with pride and joy, crowds in their millions await the official word that victory has been won in the West. Britons from the dominions, the colonies, and the homeland, with guests from occupied
George Woodcock's
countries,
friendship
stand
with
as
George
masters
Orwell
of
would
the
eventually lead him to write his award-winning biography, The Crystal Spirit. But by the time World War II ended, England was not a comfortable place to be for conscientious objectors and anarchists. So George and his wife Ingeborg set their sights on the country where George had been born and the land of his father's dreams, Canada. They followed the path of Doukhobor idealism to the west coast, where they homesteaded until they were discovered by the writer Earl Birney.
Earl Birney, well, Earl was the first writer in Canada that I knew. Earl actually came and visited me on Vancouver Island when we were living in a trailer and building a hut in 1949, in the summer of 1949.
When we first met, we were somewhat in comparable stations in life. We were poor and just making enough money to get by was very important. That's a pretty good bond.
Well, the shadboats were very important because we wouldn't really be in Vancouver if it weren't for the shadboats. We'd been living on Vancouver Island and we're getting pretty miserable at a village on Vancouver Island that I needn't name. Jack said to me, well, there's a cabin out in the bush outside behind our house. Maybe we can get you into that. At that time, all capital actually was forest. There were no houses. And it was wonderful living there among the forests, looking out over the harbour. That's where we started off in Vancouver. So Jack was really responsible for our coming to Vancouver. And then living together up on this hill, we became very close friends.
Their pattern was largely Inge acting as sort of good-natured critic of George. She would say, now, George, you're talking too much. Just quiet down, let us do talking, this sort of thing. She always adopted this sort of slightly critical stance toward George. I'd call it a stance, it was only good-natured. And obviously she loved him very dearly.
She's been a wonderful partner in my career. She cares for me in my sickness. She gives me ideas, which I sometimes badly need. And on the other hand, in the organization, she is a superb organizer. I am the ideologue of the group.
Another person with whom you corresponded a great deal was Al Purdy. Could you tell me a little bit about your relations with Al and why you think you became close friends?
Well, a lot of people find it rather strange that we should be close friends. A rowdy poet and a cautious critic, as some people see me. And so that they think, well, this is just all that can be here is incompatibility. But in fact, that isn't true, because we've got a great deal in common: a poverty-stricken childhood with a domineering mother, a period scrounging any kind of job we could get, no university education, but enormous erudition arrived at just by reading. Al is one of the most erudite people I know.
Could you tell me about your relationship with the Dalai Lama?
We're very warm and close to each other, and I think that he regards us in a very friendly way, because we were one of the first people who actually went and sought him out and saw what his problems were and started to work on them.
At last, the moment of the Dalai Lama's first examination approaches. Wearing the special yellow hat which denotes his office as head of the most important sect of Tibetan Buddhists, the Gelugpa sect, he comes in procession to the great court of the monastery, and the monks and brilliantly robed noblemen wait to watch the debates that will follow.
He fled in 1959. We went into 61 and met him then. And we had a long talk in Dharamsala in 61. And we promised to come back and do something, and we did it. I think a lot of people must have promised to do things, never did, but we did. And I think he's treasured that. So he refers to us as his old friends, not merely his friends, his dear, dear old friends.
I think travelers, and possibly also historians and archaeologists and anthropologists, are people who, for one reason or another, are somewhat alienated by their own society, who are outsiders or outcasts, as Julian Barnes had it. And yeah, I think you need that quality, that feeling that where you were born and where you grew up and where you were conditioned or socialized into your home culture, that isn't all there is, and that isn't enough for you. And so George, I think, exemplifies that.
Of course, our first big travel was to India, and that was to do the book, The Walls of India, which I painted and George wrote. And that was a wonderful experience for me, and I'm sure it was for George. We had a great deal of fun out of doing that. And the idea, of course, was to raise money for Canada-India Village Aid, which I'm the vice chair of that, and George was the chair of that originally, and he brought that into existence in order to bring aid to some of the very poorest villages in India. So what we did was, and we both agreed that it was probably the best thing to do, would be to start a training program for sort of barefoot doctors.
It's part of the genius of George, and I use genius very carefully, that he can always convince you that the minority position, although hopelessly outnumbered, although almost completely unpopular, although derided and reviled and made to seem risible, is in fact the correct one. And he does that through the force of his logic and the beauty of his prose and the gentleness and persistence of his voice.
On the 23rd of January, 1899, the steamship Huron docked in the port of Halifax with 2,000 Russian immigrants. They were the first of the 7,500 Doukhobors who in that year migrated to Canada.
Our relationship with the Doukhobors is a very friendly one. Of course, they were, when I first started to work on the Doukhobors, they were suspicious, as they are of all outsiders, because they've had a bad press. But once I got to know them, I found that they were great friends, and I could live among them. We lived among them for short periods with great friendship, great understanding.
To some, they have appeared an insufferably persecuted minority. To others, they have seemed a group of antisocial troublemakers. Between the two extreme points of view, the image of the Doukhobor has become confused.
The whole theory behind the Doukhobor movement is that the leaders are the inspired spokesmen of the community, and everything is decided at a meeting called a sobranie, which is partly a hymn-singing religious meeting and partly a meeting to decide the practical affairs of the community. And so they do have this kind of basic anarchy.
In their long struggle against authority, the Sons of Freedom have sometimes resorted to sensational means. Public stripping, burning down their own and other people's houses. In 1932, 745 Sons of Freedom were arrested in a single month for nudism. Their 300-odd children were segregated in various institutions.
So they live in a curious kind of half-world between anarchism and theocracy. I found it quite fascinating, of course. But they also called me the Canadian Tolstoy, and I felt, what would I be, Tolstoy, living among his admirers, that I would probably have no privacy at all, so I decided against it.
The Christian community now began to prosper. But then there came the first of many disagreements with the Canadian authorities. It changed the whole course of Doukhobor history in this country.
I suppose I do have the outsider mentality. That's why I welcome the development these days of the underground economy and all this sort of thing. This is the kind of world I like.
Freedom of the City of Vancouver is hereby bestowed upon George Woodcock. It is the highest award the city can give to any of its citizens, so it's not given out freely.
Because they're making the outsider into an insider, aren't they?
Yes, and
they're taking me into the city in the most intimate way they can.
And you are, but you are accepting this quite consciously.
Yes, consciously,
and so
because I believe in that connection between freedom and the city. I have still something on my mind: freedom. It is a word worth repeating, for I have been given, what I have been given is by definition a freedom medal. And the great role of cities in the development of our ideals and practice of freedom has not always been recognized or fully understood. In the Middle Ages, the merchants and artisans of Europe created their own free cities on the seacoast and riverbanks of the feudal world. People who lived outside the cities were mostly the vassals or serfs of lords or kings. People in the cities carried on their trade and their industries and practiced their arts in free cooperation and defended themselves through their guilds and fraternities. And when a serf, fleeing from a tyrannical landlord, found his way through the city gates and was accepted, he became a free man in name and in practice. I see this association of the city and of mental and physical freedom as an important, valuable tradition not to be lost. I see myself as a symbolic descendant of that fleeing serf, and that is why I feel such pleasure at becoming a freedom of my own city of Vancouver. Thank you for your attention, your worship, ladies and gentlemen.
He's meant the steady, long-term presence of a man of letters. There are lots of people who do books, write books, but there aren't many people of letters, so I think of it, and somebody who belongs to a tradition of letters and has all that in his background, and managed to represent that somehow, in without being what you'd think of as a popular public figure. He represented it nonetheless in everything he did, certainly in the books, in the range of the books, in the steadiness of the books. He refused to be a specialist in an age of specialization. His work with the Canadian literature, I mean his creation really of Canadian literature, that was certainly known and must have been unbelievably supportive to a growing community of writers in this province.
When I published Survival in 1972, which is about Canadian literature, there were still a lot of people then who said, "Why are you writing a book on this? It doesn't exist." So you can imagine what editing a magazine devoted to this subject in 1959 would have been like. A lot of people saying, "This is ludicrous. Why do they have a magazine devoted to this non-existent subject?" But for us, the young writers, it was what they now call a very validating thing.
And Canadian literature came along, and Woodcock didn't know all that much about Canadian literature, so he was teaching himself, as he says, Canadian literature as he was going along. But the whole idea that you could do that, have a magazine about Canadian literature, and have Canadian writers writing in it, not just professors, started me on my career as a Canadian writer instead of just a writer.
I am always impressed by his reasonableness, his sheer knowledge. The only other person I've known with that kind of knowledge was W.H. Auden.
He's influenced me in my work habits. I mean, he shames everybody. You know, he produces so much. It always amazes me.
Julian Barnes said that the writer in Flaubert's Parrot, he said that the writer must be an outcast by nature and universal in sympathy. And I think that applies very well to George as well.
But you know, one of the things that's remarkable about him is that he's prolific. And in this country, if you're prolific, it's considered that you're lousy. George Woodcock is not only prolific, but he is good. And he has made it easier for some of the rest of us who are accused of turning out too much stuff.
Right.
I think that in that sense he's been a pioneer.
The third and final volume of your autobiography is forthcoming. What's the title and what are we going to find in it?
The title is Walking Through the Valley, meaning walking near to death, or the Valley of the Shadow, of course. And really it's a summing up to an extent. It's an account of things I've done in the last 15 years, but it is also a reflection on my life as a whole. You realize that, in fact, your life as you conceive it is a great fiction, and writing an autobiography in a way is elucidating the fiction. I saw you first as a cloud fettered to a tree whose huge gnarled branches draped a long-lived wooden house. We saw the house and the tree, its grey against your white. We bought the house and you continued to inhabit your root-filled habitat. Your branches cracked. Tree surgeons praised your age as they lopped another limb, and you gave half-winter's firewood. I ached when I saw it burn. You had become my brother, wakening the year with splendid regularity, marking the lustre. And as your essence failed and fewer boughs bore fruit, I felt my own heart fail. You had become again, as Lowry saw his peer. And while I watch your dying, I know my own will follow, and as calmly know it as you in your dryad mind.
You know, I used to say to him when I'd be busy myself and working hard, you know, that my work wasn't going to get done posthumously. He really understood that, you know, and he used to work all night. And you know, he doesn't want people wasting time, you know, weeping over him. So we're going to have a party, and I think that's really what George wanted, to have all his friends around and just to talk about their memories with him.
This is George's cherry tree on Cherry Street. Feels right to end here, perhaps with the words of George's oldest friend, the English writer Julian Simmons, who said, "I know of nobody who has been of more generous help to others or pursued good ends in life more unswervingly." Thanks for watching Book World. See you next week.
Я ветки посадила,